Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, it's an honor and privilege to be here. I see Imam Rauf is here. I saw him a little bit ago, and I want to make sure to say salam to him. It's always an honor to be here, alhamdulillah. And inshallah, today what we'll be doing, I'm trying something different. MashaAllah, I think this Fajr program, the Breakfast Club, MashaAllah, is a beautiful, beautiful initiative. And I think the types of things we're normally used to hearing are reminders. And of course, all reminders are benefit. And the Prophet ﷺ told us about the importance of a reminder, to the point where majority of the khutub of the Prophet ﷺ, as narrated by Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, were illa tadhkirah. They weren't anything except for a reminder, illa dhikrin in another narration. But today I'm going to do something a little bit different. My goal is going to be to give you a snippet of Muslim history. And it's a subject that requires a lot of attention for a couple of different reasons. But one major one will be is because most of us, unfortunately, don't really know our history all that well. If I ask, alhamdulillah, I get the opportunity of working with a lot of young Muslims quite frequently. Alhamdulillah, I work as a Muslim chaplain at Rutgers. And even amongst the most practicing of our youth, if I ask them to describe to me Muslim history, they usually say something like this. They'll be able to give me an outline of the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. Alhamdulillah, that is a great thing that most of us go through in our education, which they'll be able to give me a little bit about where Islam originated, at least in terms of the message of the Prophet ﷺ began in Mecca. They'll be able to tell me between the Meccan period and the Madani period, and how the Prophet ﷺ returned and conquered Mecca in a beautiful way, and that the Khilafah was established. They'll be able to tell me the names of the first 4 Khalifas. They'll be able to say Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, Umar radiallahu anhu, Uthman radiallahu anhu, and Ali radiallahu anhu. But then if I ask any specifics of what happened, they'll say something happened with Uthman radiallahu anhu, which I'm not too sure about. I know that happened. And then they'll say something like, and then there was a golden age in Spain. It's like, wait, what? How did Muslims get from Arabia to Spain? And then if I ask even the most basic question, which is, what's the biggest Muslim country on earth? They'll be able to tell me something like, oh, Indonesia. Like, how did Islam get there? What happened in between? We have such major holes in our understanding of history, to the point if I ask, why are there 55 Muslim countries today? They'll just be silence, because we don't know our history. And when we don't know our history, anyone could tell us anything. And a lot of young people actually start losing their faith because someone else tries to teach them their history. So, what I'm going to try to do today, I don't have a lot of time. How much time do I have until 7:15?
7:50.
Okay.
You can do 7:20.
Okay, inshallah. What I'm going to try to do today is actually give us one small snippet of Muslim history. And where this is coming from is I teach what I'm taking this from, is actually something I taught last month. And in a small book club that takes place in in Tina, it's called the Sakina Book Club, or Sakina Institute. But anyway, in it I've been teaching a book called Destiny Disrupted. And it's a book that tries to go over a summary of Muslim history, a look at Muslim history through Islamic eyes. And it's this approach of like, how would a Muslim who's just trying to give you a story about what happened to us as a civilization tell you their story? But I don't only take from that, I will usually add to it Tarikh al-Tabari, which is one of our earliest books of history, written by a very early Muslim scholar, where he tried to get as many of the narrations of what happened to the Prophet ﷺ in the first 300 years as he could. And the Muqaddimah, Ibn Khaldun's book of history as well, which was written in Muslim Spain. Actually, just last night in Tinik, we went through a brief history of Muslim Spain, from literally Tariq bin Ziyad, the one who conquered into Spain, to the expulsion of Muslims, where over 5 million Muslims were killed over the period of 150 years in the great expulsion that took place. It was a massive genocide that happened. We went through that yesterday. I also incorporated into it 2 other texts, The Crisis of Muslim History, written by Mahmoud Ayyub, a very interesting Muslim scholar who just passed away 2 years ago, and A History of Islamic Societies from a non-Muslim perspective by Ira Lapidus. I try to put all of these together so that we can have a comprehensive view of history. I'm going to only go over, my goal today is to give you a little bit of understanding on when the Muslims were invaded by two groups of people, the Crusaders and the Mongols, and how the response to those two different invasions tell us a lot about what is our inheritance and what Islam can move us to do. Does that make sense? That's my major goal today. But in order for me to do that, I have to give you a little bit of background as to what is going on in the Muslim world at this point. I have 106 slides. We are not going to be able to go over 106 slides. I'm maybe going to go over 7 of them today in detail, but I'm going to run through it, inshallah. Everyone with me? I'm going to need your minds to stretch a little bit today, because this is a topic that we don't normally talk about. So, where I began this was actually understanding the Khilafah. There are two major Khilafah that took place in our tradition. When the Prophet ﷺ, most of us have studied Seerah to some extent, but when the Messenger ﷺ was taken from this Ummah, when he passed away in 631, when the Messenger ﷺ passes away, we know that after him, Abu Bakr becomes the Khalifa. It's not generally contested, but he becomes the Khalifa. And at that time, where the Muslims were, if I'm going to look at a map, where the Muslims were, was majority of the Arabian Peninsula, not quite the furthest south of it and not quite the furthest north of it, had become under the rule of Islam. That's what had taken place. Under the Khilafah of Abu Bakr, they maintained, and the entirety of what we would call the Hijaz region was Muslim. Under the Khilafah of Umar, Islam expanded very rapidly. Abu Bakr is a Khalifa for only a short amount of time, for just a couple of years. Umar is a Khalifa for 10 years, a little bit over a decade. And under him, Islam reaches as far west as the Maghrib region. It goes as far east to what we would call current-day Afghanistan, pushing into what we would call Pakistan as well. It's pushing in there, at least in the conquest, and it goes as far north as the upper edge of Syria. You don't need to remember all of these, but just know there's a lot of expansion. After Umar, and we have all those beautiful stories of what takes place under the Khilafah of Umar, there were a lot of struggles, but there were also a lot of beauty and the growth of the religion took place a lot at the time of Umar. But there's one thing that I want us to remember, is Muslims expanded just like many empires in the past have expanded, but there's two key differences. One is the speed at which it happened. Under Umar ibn Khattab, and under, of course, the companions of the Messenger ﷺ, Allah granted this ummah victory that we have not seen since. What I mean by that is, Muslims expanded to such a situation that it took the Romans about 700 years to get as much land as the Muslims did in 12. Under the Khilafah Abu Bakr and Umar, the amount of land that the Muslims were in control over, it took the Romans hundreds of years to get to. And under Umar ibn Khattab, actually, two major things take place. In the Battle of Qadisiyah, which takes place in 677, not 677, 637. The major Persian empire fell, and the Persian Empire, or the Sassanid Empire, is completely destroyed. And under also Umar's Khilafah, the major army of the Byzantine Empire is also destroyed in two battles. Both Alexandria, which was known as the breadbasket of the world. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala return Egypt to its former glory. Ameen. But what was known literally as a city that fed the world, and also Jerusalem, which was the religious capital, fall under Umar ibn Khattab. That takes place. But Muslims expand very, very rapidly in this period of time. And why the 2 points of distinction is Umar had two very interesting perspectives, or two very interesting practices. He would tell the invading army of Muslims, you are not allowed to go into the city. What you need to do is actually establish a city next to the city you just conquered. And the reason he would do that is, he had 3 things that he would say. Muslims should not be corrupted by the lifestyles of these cities. That shouldn't take place. to you shouldn't disturb the people of these cities. And it was very easy for the Muslims to actually go and conquer these places because they've been under rule by both the Romans and by the Persians. It keeps going back and forth who's ruling who. It's been these giant empires have been fighting for over 1,000 years. They keep fighting with each other. And so when the Muslims come in, they were actually seen as liberators. Because why? They come in and finally someone other than these two who keep conquering us. That's the perspective. So many times actually the local townspeople would join the Muslims in fighting the main army. Umar ibn Khattab said, you don't enter into the city, but you take advantage of the trade route that exists there and the resources of like water and food that's supposed to go there. So he establishes what's known as garrison cities. That's why our tradition, when we see its rapid expansion, no period in time in history has more cities been built than the expansion that took place under the original Khulafa al-Rashidun and amongst the Umayyad expansions. Why? Because anytime the Muslim army would go somewhere, they would build a city off to the side. The first reason was so that we don't disturb the people. Second reason, so the Muslims don't get corrupted by that culture. And third, very importantly, because the Muslims are there to actually take over governance, Islam was not spread by the sword. Under the Khulafa al-Rashidin and eventually under the Umayyad Empire, I have really a good map of this, but we're just going to keep this right here. There would be approximately 5 million people who are living under Muslim lands. Anyone know what percentage of them were Muslim? Want to take a guess? When the initial expansions take place. There were approximately 5 million people living under Muslim rule. Take a guess at how many of them were Muslim.
15%.
Good guess, 15%. Anyone else want to take another guess?
10%.
10%. Anyone else want to take another guess?
30%?
30%.
40%?
Approximately 3%. Why I want that to sink in for a second is, under Muslim rule, sometimes there's this misnomer that Islam was spread by the sword. When the Muslims had conquered a majority of what we would know as the Muslim lands today, and they were ruling, maybe 3% of them were Muslim. Muslims never conquered or never forced conversions. That's not a part of our history. And actually, we never burned a city to the ground. Most empires, when they expand, you can look at the geological record and see a dust cloud tape of fruit, because, or like find its way into the rocks, because cities were burned down, crops were burned. When the Muslims expanded, we don't see any evidence of it. The only evidence we have of the Muslims' expansion was the building of cities, not the destruction of cities. I want that to sink in so that we can reclaim, when we expanded, we didn't cause death and destruction. We're going to talk about a people who did. The Mongols, when they invade the Muslims, they will massacre. When Muslims did, they didn't. Muslims would fight the armies of Persia, would fight the armies of the Roman Empire. When an army fights, the average person doesn't get affected. And I want also, sometimes we have a misnomer of what battle looks like. When we think of a battle, we think of hundreds of people dying, which does take place. But that's more thinking about it from a modern lens. One of the most bloody battles in Muslim history, at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, we would say it was actually the Battle of Badr had a high number of casualties in it. And some of us are familiar with the Battle of Badr. What happens is 313 Muslims, 1,072 Kuffar, right? Most are familiar with the battle. And even know what the death rate was of that battle? Yes?
14 people died in the battle?
It's a Jazakallah khairan, mashallah. May Allah increase you in knowledge, I mean. So our little one knew the answer. 14 Muslims lost their lives, 13 in battle, 1 from injury. And from the non-Muslims, 54 people lost their lives. That's a lot, but I want you to think about it. How many people fought again? Approximately 1,400, like 1,370 some, fought in this battle, right? How many people died again? 54 plus 13, like less than 70. What's the mortality rate? 6%? 5 to 6%? That was actually high compared to what happened in most battles at that time. Why I want that to sink in is when we think about battle today, we think about things like World War II, in which the average battle in World War II, the mortality rate was 80%. Back then, sometimes we think it's more barbaric, it was way more civilized when that occurred. his two armies meet up in a battlefield. And they fight until one of them gets tired or doesn't feel like fighting anymore, and then they would just leave. That's how battle used to take place. Sometimes we think we're in a more civilized world today. That was a more civilized time in many ways. Are you following me? This even wasn't a part of what I was going to speak on. This is just the introduction. But anyway, the Muslims expand pretty rapidly. There are many, dozens of cities are built. Najaf, Kufa, Basra, these are all cities that are built by the Muslims next to the trade routes that already existed. And Muslims expand pretty rapidly into what we would call the Muslim world today. Under the Khilafah of Uthman, there's a lot of dissent that takes place. Because the Ummah expands so rapidly that the governors he is installing to keep the peace isn't working out like it did under the Khilafah of Umar ibn Khattab. And part of that has to do with maybe a personality of ruling. I'm not going to get into that completely. But two Khilafahs take place. Uthman, there's massive complaints. He addresses all of the complaints. But then, and he replaces a lot of his governors. Because the people who are under Muslim rule are saying, we don't like these rulers that you've appointed. He replaces them. There's a lot of disagreements, even amongst the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, of how they are supposed to be managing this giant space that they've now been given the amana of. Uthman is killed by dissenters who are now called the Qurra, but they come mainly from Egypt. But they come from this place and he's killed, and there's turmoil in the Ummah. Muawiyah, the cousin of Uthman, who is in charge of the most powerful, he's in charge of the most powerful, this is how long they had expanded under the Umayyads. But Muawiyah is in charge of the most powerful region at that point, but the most wealthy region, Damascus or Syria. He says, I'm not going to join the Khalifa or recognize any Khalifa until the murderers of Uthman, and this could never happen again. And Ali radiallahu anhu also becomes a Khalifa because his priority is the Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam has to be under leadership. It needs to pass on. That takes priority. This is what's known as the great fitna that occurs. This isn't the point of today's history. Eventually what ends up happening is even Ali radiallahu anhu, there's a truce that takes place, there's battles between them, but eventually Ali radiallahu anhu has a khilafah and Muawiyah radiallahu anhu has a khilafah that take place, and the Ummah is divided. Ali radiallahu anhu unfortunately is also killed by the same people that killed Uthman radiallahu anhu. There's massive dissent that's taking place. And Muawiyah rules as the first of the Umayyad Khalifas. The Umayyad Khalifas, they turned it into a dynasty. The Prophet ﷺ did not leave this Ummah as a dynasty. Abu Bakr is not from the family of the Prophet ﷺ. Umar is not from the family of the Prophet ﷺ. Uthman is elected, but he's a second cousin. He's not a direct descendant of the Prophet ﷺ. He didn't leave it as bloodlines. But Muawiyah, not necessarily him, but his children, transform it into a dynasty. And we see some of the biggest tragedies this Ummah has ever seen as a result of that. The grandchildren of the Prophet ﷺ, Hassan and Hussein are assassinated because the Khalifa in Damascus is worried people are going to listen to them more than they listen to him. His name is Yazid. He ends up being the son of Muawiyah. Very tough times we go through in history. And we have to know this history so that other people can't teach it to us. Again, not what I'm going to be focusing on today. But all of this takes place. Eventually, that dynasty comes to an end. The Umayyads, 12 Khalifas later, the people can't take it anymore. They're like, you guys are corrupt. You guys cause a bunch of issues. So they oust them. A man by the name of Abu Muslima actually ousts the Umayyad Khalifa and destroys the Umayyad family and establishes, is that me moving? Sorry. And establishes the Abbasid dynasty. And that's where we actually pick off from today, is the Abbasid dynasty is what's following through. And that's a quick introduction, just introducing when the Crusades happened. Under the Abbasids, you start off with the first of them. They trace their lineage back to Al-Abbas, the uncle of the Prophet ﷺ, but his Safa. It's the first Abbasid Khalifa, and then it goes down. The most important one for us to remember will be Al-Mansur and Al-Mutawakkil. Al-Mansur does something that no Khalifa before him has done. He tries to dictate for the Muslims what Muslims should believe and what Muslims should not believe in what is known as the mihna, or al-ma'mun, my apologies, a couple of generations later, where he says to Muslims that you all need to believe that the Quran is created, and anyone who doesn't believe the Quran is created, I'm going to imprison them. He starts imprisoning scholars. The only reason I'm mentioning this is the people will eventually revolt. The major scholar who's attributed this accolade is actually Ahmad ibn Hanbal, may Allah be pleased with him, that he actually holds fast and says, we will never say the Quran was created. The Quran is eternal, and Allah is eternal, and we don't mind that there's a theological problem there, because if you say the Quran is created, you are likely to change it. So he stands his ground, and what wins out is anytime a authority tries to change Islam, the people will revolt. And Ma'mun is taken out, and Mutawakkil reverses the mihna. Now, so there's this whole thing of who controls it. If anyone wants to read a book on this, a really good was Inquisition in Early Islam. There's never been a forced religious belief system that Muslims have done to non-Muslims. There has been a forced attempt for Muslims to change what other Muslims believe, but it didn't work. Ahmad ibn Hanbal wins out. So what gets established by this incident is Muslims have been hurt by their rulers over and over and over again, but if it doesn't affect their deen, they don't really mind. But if it starts getting to the point of hurting their deen or their lives, they will revolt. That gets established with the mihna. Is everyone following me? I know this is going over a bit. The whole point we're going to get to is what was the state of the Muslims at the time of the Crusades. But one of the things that happens at this point is the average Muslim who's living in these lands, this is now 200 years after the Prophet ﷺ in 832. 837 is when the mihna gets reversed. The average Muslim doesn't care about who their leaders are anymore, because the leaders have been so corrupt, kind of been all over the place, that anyone could really rule. As long as their day-to-day doesn't get changed, it doesn't matter. And the state and the average Muslim's practice actually separate from each other. The Khalifa doesn't control laws. Local Muslim communities do. You don't learn your deen or things from the government anymore. You have local teachers for that. All of the madahib are established. Sometimes we ask the question, why do we have madahib in our tradition? Why does that take place? Well, it's actually because it separated the palace from the practice of the people. That people would say, I'm going to learn my Islam from so-and-so, who's going to establish a school and teach people that is separate from the actual mandates of the palace. Following me? Moving forward, what eventually takes place, and for those who want resources of what I'm saying, I had to teach this as a course, so a bunch of resources. I'm happy to share this PowerPoint with whoever wants it, inshallah. But eventually, what ends up happening is, and I'm just going to say this for the sake of understanding of historically where we are. The Ummah started off in Medina with the Prophet ﷺ. His khilafah, if we want to call that, was in Medina. Anyone know who moves it to Kufa? They moved the capital to Kufa. Who did it? And he had a beautiful statement. He said, what I have seen happen by the leadership of the Muslims, I never want to see happen, and I never want the Prophet ﷺ to be disturbed by what they are doing and what they are saying. Because he realized, after the assassination of Uthman, which doesn't happen, thankfully, in Medina, but after the assassination of Uthman, he realizes leadership of this Ummah is going to be all over the place. So he moves the capital to Kufa, and it starts moving further and further north. I actually did this just on Google Maps because I had a plan to visit all of these places. But it goes from Medina to Kufa to Damascus in Syria, that's where Muawiyah rules from, to Raqqa, to Baghdad, it's built by Al-Mansur, the first Abbasid Khalifa, to Samarra, and then to eventually Hashemiyah, and it's going to move further and further from actually Mecca and Medina. So that's taking place. Majority of the politics of the Ummah are taking place right now in between Hashemiyah and Baghdad. Hashemiyah doesn't exist anymore because it's destroyed by the Mongols. We'll talk about that a little bit later on today. SubhanAllah, we're at 7 o'clock already. Okay. But anyway, now that we're moved on from there, what I really wanted to get to is Muslims actually disjoint to the point where under the Abbasid Khilafah, what eventually starts happening 850 onward is there's one Abbasid Khalifa who's almost like a figurehead. That everyone says, oh yeah, of course you're the Khalifa. But there are at one point 9 different people who are claiming to be the Khalifa at the same time. 4 of them are Shi'i dynasties. The Qarmats of Bahrain that no longer exist. The Fatimids, an Ismaili group. Ismaili Shias exist to this day, but not in the same degree of power. The Hamdanids, who would be what we would call today current-day Ithna Ashari Shi'i tradition. And the Buwayhids, who also don't exist today, but they produce some very interesting literature. And under the Sunni dynasties, or Sunni rulers, there are the Samanids, the Ghaznavids, the Seljuks, the Murids, and the Khwarizm Shahs. There's 5 different rulerships, and all of these people are claiming to be Khalifa. You might think this is such disunity, and it is. It's disunity. But in this time, this is oftentimes what's known as the Golden Age of Islam. So some of our greatest scholars actually came out from an ummah that looked like this. Why that's important is, we didn't really care who our leadership was. When what? Things are going fine. Some of the most amazing books of medicine are being produced at this time. Ibn Sina writes a book called Qanun al-Tib. He writes it in late 800s. It's published publicly in 920. It's used as the de facto textbook for the next 1,000 years. Oxford uses it, literally Oxford, yes, the one in England, until 1864. The same book that Qanun al-Tib that he wrote at that time. Architecture expanded to where it's never been seen before. Transportation expanded, medicine expanded. All of these fields are expanding because why? Generally, though the Muslim leadership is divided, Muslims are actually flourishing and producing the most amazing works of tafsir, of poetry, of literature, of advances in sciences. There's a lot of good things happening at this time, even though politically things are very divided. But moving on still, what eventually ends up happening is, this was just a description of each of them. I'm not going to go through it too much. But eventually what ends up happening is what's happening in Europe at this time. So this is where the Arab Islam before the Crusades. We're finally getting to that first point that I wanted to make, which was the invasion of the Crusades. That's Arab Islam. All of that is under the Abbasid Khilafah, but it's all small rulerships. Anywhere between 9 and 17 rulers are claiming ownership over these lands, but they're all generally speaking Muslim. Everyone following me still? I know this is a lot of information. But what happens now in Europe? While the Muslims have been expanding and going through this golden age, Europe has been going through what's known as the medieval ages. Why is it called the medieval? Because life in Europe is terrible. The Roman Empire, this massive empire that used to once stand, the Western Roman Empire has been invaded by barbarians in the north and has fallen, and it's chaos. Feudalism is the form of practice of government that most people have, which is that there's one king, he gives out his land to a couple of nobles, and majority of people, I want to say 95% of people, are known as serfs. Means all they do is farm the land, and there's not really any means of social mobility. And the church has been ruling for a long time. And Thomas Hobbes would describe this moment in history as life is nasty, brutish, and short. The average lifespan of a person, 37 years old. That doesn't mean that the average person lived to 37, they probably lived into their 40s, but there were so many people dying young that the average age became 37. Europe is going through a very difficult time right now, but 2 or 3 major innovations start taking place. One is they discover the steel-tipped, I forgot what that thing is called. Hoe? Right? Pulley? Whatever that is, they developed a steel-tipped component of it, so now they can farm a little bit more efficiently. And they can farm lands that they haven't farmed before. The other thing that starts to happen is they discover that if they can change, they develop a tri-cross system of agriculture where they don't plow the same fields over and over again. That's actually called a plow. But they switch off fields, so there's more now wealth coming into Christianity. And there's another major problem that's starting to take place, which is that all of these refugees are coming from what's known as the Western Roman Empire into the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. And they're like, there's so many refugees, there's more wealth than there has been before, what do we do with it? So Urban II comes up with he's the Byzantine ruler at this time. He's like, what do I do with all these refugees? I know, send them over to the Muslims, reconquer the Holy Land that they lost from the Muslims. Why they're doing this is a social problem. We have all these refugees coming in, they have wealth more than they've ever had, but we don't have enough land. So he says, go recover the Holy Land. Go invade. The Muslims have been conquering land from us for, at this point, 250 years. Go invade and get them. And they start doing it. They're not an organized front. Actually, when they're attacking the Muslims, they're killing Muslims, they're killing Jews, and actually they killed probably more Jews in the first crusade than they did Muslims. Because they're just trying to just take land for themselves, because it's been a very problematic situation they found themselves in. Which is, we don't know where to go, and we have more wealth than we've normally had. So they start invading the Muslim lands, and they take a lot of cities. They take Iznak, they take Edessa, they take Antioch. 1097, 1098, 899, they take Jerusalem. And this is a different type of taking cities than Muslims have done. To the point where when they took Jerusalem in 1099, it's the bloodiest single battle in history till World War II. And when I say the bloodiest single day in history, in World War II there was one day in which 217,000 people lost their lives. It was Hiroshima and Nagasaki when the atomic bomb was dropped. The world has not seen devastation like that ever since, and inshallah we'll never see devastation like that again. But it was bloody. The time before that, the single bloodiest day in history was when the Crusaders took the city of Jerusalem. They killed every man, woman, and child, to the point where the Crusaders, in their own sources, said we would walk through areas of blood up to our knees and up to our waists. They didn't let the animals survive. It was a bloody day. And again, this was not how Jerusalem was conquered by Umar ibn Khattab. He fought the army of the Roman Empire on a battlefield. The whole city was slaughtered. Even the Christians who were living there, the city was slaughtered. There'll be a couple of arguments of why the Christians invaded. There was this Fatimid ruler, his name was Hakim bin Amrillah, who had the year prior, or 4 years prior, actually destroyed the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is the place where Jesus was apparently crucified. So the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. He destroys it, but Hakim bin Amrillah was also what we would call a mad king. He, just so people can understand how mad he was, anyone know what Molokhia is? Molokhia is like, it's kind of like a spinach soup. I know I'm butchering this, but it's kind of like a spinach soup. He didn't like it, so he banned its export in the entirety of the Fatimid Muslim world. He was kind of crazy, but he destroyed this. Muslims generally have been really good to Christians, and Christians could come whenever they wanted in the Crusades. But he destroys it, and that's one of the motivating factors for why the Crusaders are really jumped into Jerusalem. But they destroy and kill like there hasn't been seen in history for a long time. By some estimates, 100,000 people were killed in the massacre of Jerusalem. By the Christian accounts of this, the Crusaders made their way into the city through the Tower of David and began mastering large numbers of inhabitants, Muslims and Jews alike. The Fatimid governor of the city, Iftikhar al-Dawla, managed to escape. According to eyewitness accounts, the streets of Jerusalem were filled with blood. How many people were killed in this is a matter of debate, with the figure well over 100,000 given by Muslim historians. And we have other kind of accounts of this that start taking place. According to Raymond of Aguilar, also writing solely on the Temple Mount area, in the temple and the porch of Solomon, men rode in blood up to their knees and into their bridle reins. In this temple alone, 10,000 people were killed. So you have lots of like historical things. This was a massacre that took place. Of course, this angers the Muslims pretty significantly. When we see the Crusades, there's a couple of ways to put them together. According to the Christian point of view, there's anywhere between 12 and 6 Crusades that take place. According to the Muslim views, there's only 2 real Crusades that take place, or 3. The Christian viewpoint of this, the first Crusade, 1095 to 1099, they take Jerusalem from the Muslims. Second one is, after the loss of Edessa, we're not going to get through this too much, but you have many different versions of the Crusades that happen. For us, what I want us to remember is, according to the Muslims, there's only actually 2 major responses to the Crusades. But it'll be Christians take land, we take land back from them, and then they keep randomly invading us. That's the Muslim view of the Crusades. The Christian view of the Crusades is, the first Crusade led by two orders, the monastic knights and the order of the Templars. Monastic knights actually end up being legitimately Christian. The Knights Templars are the ones who are like the most problematic and cause a lot of issues for the Muslims and for history later on. But they invade, they're under the auspices of the Byzantine Empire, and they come in and they conquer a lot of Muslim lands. This is the order in which they took. They start off in Antioch, go to Tripoli, eventually get to Jerusalem. But that's about as far as they expand. Muslims hear that they're about to go to Damascus, which is one of the biggest Muslim areas in the world at this point, one of the most Muslim populated cities in the world. Once that happens, the Muslims unite. Crusade 2 takes place, nothing really happens in this point, but they try to occupy Damascus and they try to get back to Alexandria. And Muslims, something interesting that's historically, when Jerusalem got conquered, Muslims were very sad, but they didn't unite or form an army. But once they heard that they were coming for Damascus, suddenly Muslims responded. And the Muslim reactions to Crusade 1 and 2 was in Aleppo, there was this dynasty known as the Zengid dynasty. And they had two slaves. There was a weird practice that the Muslims started practicing, which was, yes, slavery existed in the Muslim world, but a slave could become a ruler. So it's not slavery in the way we would call it today. But there were two slaves particularly, Imad ad-Din az-Zengi, a Turkish slave son who inherits the entirety of the Seljuk Empire. Long story short, without giving you too much of it, he's a servant, but he's a really good military general. He's a really good tactician. So he's given an army. That's why also, like, when people say Muslims have slaves, yeah, technically he was a slave, but he was given an army. What slave is given an army? It's not the same slavery as we think about in like the Western world slavery. But anyway, Imad ad-Din, he unites the people and he takes back Edessa from the Crusaders. And people suddenly are like, you're going to be our ruler. His son, Nur ad-Din az-Zengi, it's going to become really important later. He's taken as like the de facto general now of many Muslim armies. And Muslims, remember we said they were divided into many ways? The average Muslim starts saying, you know what, we actually like him better. We like them better. And he takes up rulership to the point where next who comes into power is actually Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, who is the brother of Imad, who takes over. Salah ad-Din unites the Muslims against the Crusaders to the point where he takes back every city and more that the Crusaders took from the Muslims. It's some of the most beautiful times in Muslim history, and the way he fights is also so beautiful. Whenever he fights, he causes the main army of the Crusaders to come out to him. Then he rides out and says, I know the land better than you do. So there's one really major moment of this is actually when they're trying to capture Edessa. It's called the Battle of Raqqa, and also Raqqa is a city here. So Salah ad-Din goes and rides out and shows them his army. He's got a pretty massive army. And then he rides out and says, we have an army you could never destroy. You could never get to. And so he rides out, and the whole of Christian army, they take the cross of resurrection. They believe they have the cross of Jesus with them. So they're like, we can't lose, and they have a much bigger army, an army of about 20,000 people. Salah ad-Din has about 7,000 to 8,000 people. He rides out to the middle of the desert, and he takes over all of the waterways. And then the army is a massive army of 20,000 people, and they're wearing big armor, and now they're in the desert with no water. So the army starts just losing all of their water resources and loses the will to fight. So Salah ad-Din orders his men to go and give them water. So Salah ad-Din's army now is going to the Christian army and giving them water. They all lose the will to fight, and then he conquers back the city. Very interesting. Eventually, he gets to Jerusalem. Such a beautiful kind of moment where Salah ad-Din sieges the city of Jerusalem. The siege takes place for about 30 days. The person who's in the Christian side who's supposed to be defending Jerusalem, he says, try to make terms with me. There's no way you can win this battle. And he comes to him and says, I will destroy every single person in the city, but I will not surrender the city to you. Salah ad-Din says to him, how about this? Every crusader, every woman and child can take one camel's load or one animal's load of wealth from the city and is going to be guaranteed safe passage back to any Christian land that they choose. And anyone who wants to stay there, they can stay there as long as they submit to Muslim rule. It's the most generous offer of a city being taken over that's ever really been seen. And actually, that's what takes place. And so after he reconquers Jerusalem, there's no real fighting. The only one he's against is actually the Knights Templar, who destroyed Masjid al-Aqsa. He doesn't have any mercy for them. But other than that, he allows them to go free. And Muslims have this amazing victory against the Crusaders. Lots of Muslims lost their lives through this, but that's generally what happens. And even the rest of the Crusaders that come in afterward. In 1089, a third crusade gets launched, and this time it's by 3 nations. Europe is evolving. It's no longer under the Christian Empire. You'll have England, Germany, and Frederick, who would be in charge of what we know as Prussia today. They tried to invade the Muslims. Nothing really happens. They just kind of fail. They approach Muslim lands and they fail because the Muslims are now too organized. A couple of years later, Crusades 4 happens, in which Muslims actually try to take Constantinople, which was like the crown city after Jerusalem had fallen for the Christians. They made Constantinople, which eventually will become Istanbul, and still is Istanbul to this day. Inshallah, it's always going to stay Istanbul. But Muslims try to take them, and they respond, but not much happens in this one as well. Other than there's some cool interfaith conversations that take place. Crusade number 5, same thing. What did they gain from this? There's a chess game that's played by Frederick II, and he plays against the Sultan, Al-Kamil Muhammad, and he wins the rights for Christian pilgrims to go and make pilgrimage in Jerusalem, but Jerusalem is still under Muslim land. And Crusade 6, same exact thing, lots of small Latin kings that keep trying to invade the Muslims. What I'm trying to get at here is, already 719, can I get 5 more minutes? Okay. What I'm trying to get at here is, what's the Muslim response to the Crusades? They came and they attacked us. We got hurt for a while. We kicked out all of our random leaders. We appointed for us an amazing military leader, and the Muslim army was united and pushed the Crusaders out. That's the response to the Crusades. The second thing that I want us to get into is the Mongol invasions. Anyone who wants resources that I used, you can find them here. This is going to be a very interesting, different thing. The Mongols are from the far east. Muslims were attacked by the west from the Crusaders, and the Muslims are attacked from the far east from this person named Genghis Khan and his descendants, or Genghis Khan. The odd thing that I want us to remember about this is the Mongols are going to destroy so much of the Muslim world that we haven't fully recovered yet, but the light at the end of it is they become Muslim, which makes almost no sense. But the Mongols, what does a Mongol really mean? It's a person that lives in a tent. They were in this small area in Mongolia, and there were tribes that constantly kept fighting amongst each other, and they were never unified. Tell me if this sounds familiar. Tribes that were constantly fighting against each other, never unified. There were massive empires in China and the Muslims to the east that never took them seriously, because they're like, what are they ever going to do? What does that sound a lot like?
Pre-Islamic Arabia.
Pre-Islamic Arabia, because what happens in pre-Islamic Arabia? The Romans and Persians are fighting amongst each other, and they look at these Arabs in the middle, they're not going to do anything ever. No one's going to see any history come out of them. And then what happens? They unite and subhanAllah take over. The Mongols have a very interesting similar story, where they're constantly fighting amongst each other, no one takes them seriously. And then there's one leader given to them, Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan is probably how it was said in Mongolian. But he sees a vision in which he's pagan, so he never is Muslim or anything. But he sees in his dream that there's a God of the heavens, so the God appoints him to be the ruler of the earth. If there's one God in heaven, there's going to be one God on earth. That's how he sees it for himself. So he starts going on this massive tirade. He reunites all of the Mongolian tribes. And there's different historical accounts as to why that happened. One major reason could have been, there's this thing called the El Nino Majora that takes place, where there's a lot of rain in a season, and then there's drought that takes place afterwards. So they had to coalesce resources together. And either way, he makes this massive army, and he starts invading. He first starts invading actually to the east and taking many provinces in China. That's the red that you see there. And then eventually, he talks to a Muslim ruler from the Khwarizm Shah region, the Badnamik viziers. And he sends them a couple of gifts and says, we're here to establish a trade route with you. Genghis Khan does this. That Muslim ruler made a huge mistake. He kills the messengers. you never kill an ambassador. The rule of just history. He kills them and he hands their heads back over to Mongolia and he steals the gifts. Because he's like, who are these people? They've never done anything historically, so he disrespects them. Genghis Khan will unleash a massacre on the Muslim lands that has never been seen before, where he will easily wipe out the entire armies of the Khwarizm Shah. And interestingly enough, he goes to a city that doesn't exist anymore, Gangria, I believe it was called, but it's next to what current-day Bukhara. And he goes up to the mimbar of the Muslims and says to them, Genghis Khan says to them on the mimbar, he's not giving a khutbah, but he does this on a Friday when Muslims are gathered. I am your God's punishment to you because you've lost your way. And city after city after city, Muslims are destroyed and massacred to the point where majority of Muslim cities are completely conquered. Millions of people are killed. Genghis Khan and his descendants are the first people in history that they go into the city, they kill everyone, and then they stack the skulls into a pyramid. So in case the next army came to defend, they would lose all hope because what? They saw massive pyramids of skulls being put forward. This was more massive than we've ever seen. The reason they were so successful is they had the best cavalry the world had ever seen before this. But they're massacring the Muslims to the point where some of the Muslim scholars at this point are saying these are Ya'juj and Ma'juj. Remember how in our tradition, Ya'juj and Ma'juj before the Day of Judgment come out and they're unstoppable hordes? They start treating the Mongols like that. City after city is destroyed. This is an even faster expansion than the Muslim expansion ever was. Muslims took about 80 years to expand to where they got to. The Mongols do it in 10. Partly because we built the roads. Muslims built the roads for trade, but you know what else a trade road is really good for? The cavalry coming and destroying your town. They would destroy a town, or tell them to surrender and say, now you guys fight with us. And then they would send that new town that they just conquered, their military would go and fight the next one, and once they were all tired out, the Mongols would just come and invade again. They would destroy cities and burn entire cities to the ground, to the point where the majority of the Muslim cities that had been built under the Umayyad Khilafah and the Abbasid Khilafah were completely destroyed. Millions of Muslims were killed. Arabic was outlawed. Anyone who was caught making something dhabiha, like slaughtering an animal and letting the blood drain, the punishment for that was death. Muslims were really assaulted in this moment. And something interesting that happens is the Abbasid Khalifa, when Baghdad falls, the ruler, the Mongol ruler, actually says, you know what I'm going to do? He takes him and he imprisons him. And he says to the ruler, you're a ruler, we're going to respect you. So here, why don't you come to my camp? And then he has him sit in his camp and starves him and keeps him deprived of thirst. And he said, where is your treasure hidden? And he says, oh, this is where all the treasure that I ever have is. Just don't hurt me or my family. He goes, okay. He finds the treasure. He goes, well, where's the hidden treasure? So he tells him where the hidden treasure is. And once that hidden treasure is extracted, he's asking for some food because he's been starved and bereft of water for a couple of days now. And the ruler comes up to him and says, where are we with this? Well, we'll get to Mongols in Islam. But this is Ogedao who does this. He says to him, here, I'll give you a platter of food. And he brings him gold and silver. He's like, this isn't food, this is just gold and silver. He's like, well, this is what you've been hoarding. Eat this. He can't eat it. He says, this is why you failed. You were too busy hoarding gold and silver. You were not worrying about what you should have been hoarding, which is what? They're saying, we're simple people. We just need food. We just need a place to stay. You went extravagant, and that's why you failed. It's this major thing. He does something terrible. He wraps him in a carpet and actually has the prized horses of Baghdad that this ruler was actually really into on Mansur, and he has him trample him as he's in the carpets. The Mongols were ruthless and vicious. But then, we're at the end now. I'll just say this. Why did they accept Islam? They were seen as unbeatable. The Mamluks will eventually stop them. There's an interesting ruler by the name of Feiba who comes up with a very interesting strategy of how you defeat the Mongols. Muslims weren't afraid of innovation back then. They used gunpowder as the first battle in history that gunpowder was used. It's called the Battle of Ain Jalut that takes place in 1260. And it finally stops the Mongols from invading. Because the Muslims, they don't use gunpowder to shoot people. You know what they use gunpowder for? To scare the horses. I always want this to stick in because like, our scholarship was very creative. We weren't a people that researched how to kill people. That wasn't our research. That's today's like science. A lot of it is we try to win battles to do this. Muslims use gunpowders to scare horses. That anytime the horses would come in, they would set off gunpowder so the horses would get scared and the Mongols couldn't advance anymore. That's what they used it for. But anyway, that's a battle of Anjou. That's one way that it gets stopped. But how did they accept Islam? That's the big question, right? Because this is the most strange moment in history in which the people who conquered accepted the religion of the people that they just completely destroyed. Why did that happen? It actually comes down to, there's an interesting story that takes place. There's this Sufi tariqa called the Kubrawiyya. And they made their priority that they're going to convert the Mongols. And this is a story that takes place with Ghazan Mahmud. He's among the first ones that converts to Islam. But he orders, takes over a city, and he orders that destroy all of them, take their wealth and all of this. But he said, bring in their most accomplished scholar. And he calls him into the tent and said, I've heard you pray like dogs, show us how you pray. And Maulana Rashid ad-Din, this is the legendary story that actually ends up happening, he comes into his tent and he says, this is how Muslims pray, and he starts praying 2 rak'ah. Ghazan tells one of his cronies, like one of his soldiers, to, as he's in sujood, bang his head to the ground, because it'll be entertaining for all of us to laugh. And then he ends up praying and finishing the 2 rak'ah, because he was more interested in showing him what Islam is than actually defending himself in some way. So he decides to pray and says, this is how Muslims pray. And then he leaves. Ghazan gets very affected by this. And he says, like, these people, and he writes an interesting letter. He writes this to actually Cairo, and he said, we found a group of people before you who had made God into a man, and we destroyed them. He was talking about the Christians. We found another group of people who had made God into a book, and he was talking about the Muslims, your scholars, and we destroyed them. But amongst you are a group of people that are trying to, it seems like, destroy yourself so all you can experience is God. What he was talking about is like these random Sufis, who actually the majority of Muslim ulama at that time were trying to get rid of, because they were saying there are problems. And we actually find that God is with them, so we're going to accept your religion. And first, because of that, that's one reason, will be because they actually silently, even under oppression, still tried to do da'wah. And it worked eventually. Because what happened, once the Mongols ran out of steam, we need a way to settle. They accepted Islam, that's one way. The other way was actually, this is going to be a very interesting case study. And I'll wrap up with this. I have much more to say, but I'll wrap up with this, inshallah. There were many Muslim women who were married to Mongols. Forcibly married. The biggest example of this is under the Golden Horde. There is a Mongol ruler who has taken over Beijing and the Forbidden City. Most of us don't know too much about China, but the Forbidden City is a Confucian city that no religion is allowed in. But this woman, she's under Mongol rule and she's a prisoner, but she tells her husband, I miss hearing the adhan. I miss hearing the adhan. I grew up listening to the adhan, I miss hearing the adhan. So he has a mosque constructed. That's why to this day, if you go to Beijing, there's a small mosque called the Junapa Musalla that exists, and no other religious symbol is allowed in the Forbidden City. But there's a masjid there. Why? Because she wanted to pray. And she prays. Her husband eventually becomes Muslim as well. How did the Mongols become Muslim? Was because the Muslims actually didn't decide to militarily challenge them. That wasn't it. It was in their submitted state, they never lost their faith and they kept practicing, and they eventually became Muslim. The Mongols, the ones who conquered them, became Muslim. To this day, anyone know any Mongols? Like, no. This giant empire that caused all this devastation. Anyone know any Mongols? No. They all became Muslim. And they will actually rebuild the Muslim Ummah in a way that it had never been built before, even bigger than it ever was, after conquering it. Why? This is the crux of today. Why I wanted to go through these 2 examples is, our Ummah, the Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is very resilient. It can be powerful militarily like the response to the Crusades. and what? Fight back any military might. It can do that. You know what it can also do? When it's been oppressed, it can still exist in the hearts of people to the point where it will outlast the oppressors. Does that make sense? Those are two different responses of the Muslims. The Muslims our faith can take us through a moment of subjugation, and we can still get through it with Iman and actually cause for Iman to grow, or it can resist it from the outside. I'm not here to give you an answer of who was more successful. Because if you make the argument militarily, who was more successful? The response to the Crusades. It was a more successful response. But the Crusaders still existed afterward. The Mongols, they caused a lot more devastation to the Muslims. They did. But they eventually ended up becoming Muslim. I think about this, and this keeps me up at night, that inshallah when we get to Jannah, and we see the true version of history, I would love to hear the accounts of the Muslims who caused more people to enter Jannah. The Muslim response to the Crusades, or the Muslim response to the Mongols? I don't know what the answer to that is. But why I want us to appreciate that is we can exist in both states. Our faith is so significant that in conquest and in defeat, Iman can get us through it. Our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is stronger than that. Our faith can still survive. That's what I wanted us to appreciate, inshallah, today. I know I gave you a lot of history in a short span of time. Normally it takes me about 4 hours to try to put this together. We've tried to do it in like 35, 40 minutes. But I want us to appreciate that about ourselves and look back at our history and be able to confidently say, we've been through a lot. A problem that many of us have when we talk about our history is we romanticize it so much, where young Muslims, we'll be like, well, if Muslims were so awesome back then, why are we so bad now? No, things were bad earlier. But alhamdulillah, the Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is resilient. There's a hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam in which he said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will try this Ummah like a gardener prunes their plant. That anytime it grows in a direction that it's not supposed to, it'll be cut. It'll be cut, it'll be cut. But the purpose is what? Does the farmer hate the plant? No. What do they want to do? They want to turn it into something beautiful. There's another narration of the Prophet ﷺ, in which the Prophet ﷺ talks about the people who come after him, and he will say that they will be like 50. And one of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ asks the question, Ya Rasulullah, 50 of them? Like one of them will be like 50 of them? No, the Prophet ﷺ said no, one of them will be like 50 of you. So talking about the companions of the Prophet ﷺ. Why I bring all of this up is, when we look at our history, sometimes we're scared to look at it, because there's a lot of problems that take place. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, particularly when talking about Dawud alayhi salam, so they defeated them, talking about Dawud destroying Jalut. So David killed Goliath. A small group beat a big group. And Allah gave him kingship and prophethood and taught him from which he had willed. This is the part I want us to pay attention to. وَلَا دَفْعُ اللَّهُ النَّاسَ بَعْضُهُمْ بِبَعْضٍ لَفَسَدَتِ الْأَرْضَ. If it had not been for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala checking one group by another group, there would have been fasad or corruption on the earth. This is history. One group checks another group, but it's still all by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Allah ends, Allahu dhul fadli ala al-alameen. Allah hadul fadli lil-alameen. That Allah is the one who has the full bounty of the world. It'll come and go, but Islam will survive. Faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will survive. The sunnah of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam will survive, regardless of what tragedy you see. So we study this history because we see Muslims in dire situations right now. We've been through dire situations, and we've made it through. It's not to say we do nothing. We have history of many different types of response, but all of them are still good responses. Muslims are optimistic that we are going to survive whatever situation can take place. Because you look at, oh no, Palestine, how do they still have hope? We've been through a lot, that part of the world. Rohingya Muslims being literally kicked out of their homes in Burma and forced to be in Bangladesh. A million of them. Muslims have been through a situation like that before. Muslims in China, the Uyghur Muslims. So upwards to 3 million of them in concentration camps. We're trying to be retrained. Lose your faith, lose your faith. That's the same thing the Mongols tried. Guess what? Mongols don't exist anymore. and there's 2 billion Muslims. We've been through difficulties. If we study our history and see the resiliency that we have, it'll give us the hope to get through the resiliency that we need to move forward, inshallah. With that, I'll conclude. My apologies, I took a lot longer than I was intending to. Any questions or comments I can get to, inshallah.
Maybe we can have it during the breakfast.
Maybe during practice, inshallah. This Akhlaq Shari, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us amongst those that inherit our history properly so that we're able to replicate its successes and not fall into the same traps of the people that came before us. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us amongst those that regardless of the situation we find ourselves, we preserve La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah within us so that we won't be the last link of Iman, but we will inshallah pass it on to our children to inshallah do better than we ever could. Ameen. Rabbil Alameen. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum.